So welcome to this tutorial on building API Gateway in Amazon AWS. And in this tutorial we'll be building items in both of Amazon's Lambda offering and the API Gateway offering. And we use Lambda for holding the code and the API Gateway for actually mounting the code. And so I'll just put it in here. So a Lambda function you can think of as being like a small snippet of code, or like a anonymous class maybe, or anonymous method, sorry. So like console log. That's a sort of a traditional Lambda function, something you might see in C# in a link query, something you might see in JavaScript. And then the API Gateway side of things is where we would mount it. And in this example, I'm just giving a RESTful URI that you could hit the Lambda function under. So let's start by building our gateway first. In here I've got some pre-existing APIs that I've built. Pet store was an out-of-the-box one, an example one. But I'll be using new API to create a new endpoint. So I'll just call this one YouTube. And then on the left you see our new YouTube node, and also down here you've got the I guess a beacon, which is indicating it wants you to look at it. And so the things that you may not have seen before will be flashing just to sort of draw your attention to them, say, hey, check this out. So under our new YouTube node, we've got resources, stages, and a whole bunch of other items. And resources, if we think about resources are really the endpoints under the gateway. And resources typically will model HTTP verbs such as, get, post. So let's start by creating a resource. And then in this example, we're going to be modeling a school, just something simple. So we'd call this schools to give us all schools data. And obviously this wouldn't be under my server because this is on Amazon. So it's going to be under some sort of Amazon URI. So let's create that. And then under schools, we can add methods. So we're going to add a get method, which is the default, the default URI. And we're going to use a Lambda function just to model some sort of arbitrary content. Other types, you've got a HTTP, which you can use to to wrap another endpoint. So it might be the case that we'd want schools to actually point to maybe a different web server or a different piece of software on a different URI. Which is cool because you can build your software and then give it new URIs to hit. Mock is, if you read the content there, a mock is effectively something that's going to map or transform some existing data or some given data. And map, as we know it, typically will take an inbound array or an inbound blob of data and convert it to something, a different form. So in this example, it could be we're mapping from 3 objects, A, B, C, and we want to get their names from the array. So it would be get me A name, B name, C name. And then finally, there's the AWS service. So I was thinking originally, like, what's a service? Well, actually, a service is everything that Amazon offers. So an API gateway allows you to put a front or a connection to any of these services, which makes it massively powerful. So our Lambda is set up in West, because we're in Oregon, and we don't have a function yet, so we'll have to go and create the function first before we can save. So drilling down into Lambda, we're going to create a new Lambda function. Up here we have our options of language. C# and Java are also options. You just don't see them at this point. So if we click into Node, the Node option, and then blank function, because we want to start from scratch, we'll see C# and Java later. So we can configure the triggers of Lambda. So what do we want what button do we want to make our Lambda spin up and start working? So there I just selected API Gateway. I want API Gateway to trigger my Lambda function. And then we will choose our YouTube API we created. Deployment stage is prod. We don't have any deployment stages, so that's a bit false seeing that there. We'll correct that later. And then for security, just for simplicity, I want the security open. I don't want to have to go and create any roles, any AWS IAM roles. Because ultimately, when this goes to production, it will be publicly visible, which means you don't need security. And the message here also reminds you of that. So let's leave it open. Prod we will change, and then let's click next. So you can see here you've got a name for a function that we can put in. I'm just going back to check that it hasn't created it in our API Gateway listings. So we want to get schools, and just put a quick description in here. And then Node is cool, because if we choose, say, C# or Java, it's going to want us to upload a package of code. But I want to run a scripting language for simplicity. And then here, if we look at the inline editor actually has some sort of cleverness. It's not just a dumb text blob. But this function here we're going to throw in, I want to return some fake data, just for the example. So I'm going to return an array of schools. And the interesting thing to note is that whenever we use these Lambda functions, there's always going to be a hook that we'll need to hook into, or some sort of contract that we agree to. Because when the behind the scenes code is running, it's going to say, I'll need this method signature for me to invoke, to get your actual Lambda function running. So in this case of Node, it's actually, we can see we're exporting this handler method. So I put in schools, I put in an array of fake schools. This stuff we don't care about. And then for role, this is the role that the Lambda function is going to run under. So when I first came in here, I didn't have a role. And then when I said create a custom role, it suggested, hey, how about a Lambda, whatever it was, Lambda run role. Lambda basic execution role. And I said, sure, that sounds pretty legit. Oops. So chose him. We want memory as small as possible for this. Because in theory, right, once you've run if it's a read-only API, you will need, you don't need much resources, right? Because you can cache it, and then you don't need massive computing resources. Okay, so we've got, you can see there's an error message here saying there was an error. And I believe that was, if we click into configuration, I think it was this trigger. I think it's because it was trying to push into a prod stage, which we don't have. So I'm guessing that's the error. And it makes sense in my mind. Because if you look at stages under our API, there's nothing there. And then within stages, a stage, you can think of it as being the different environments that it goes upstream in. So it could be dev or your local machine, it could be test, perhaps a production machine. We have none of these yet, so let's go and create an instance for test. So you can see that our Lambda function did sneakily push itself into this API under get schools. So let's quickly create our stage or environment. Let's call it test environment. All right, yeah. This was, I think, me doing chicken and the egg, indicated by the deployment drop-down not being clickable. So let's test our function, our Lambda function that we built, just to make sure that it works. We don't need any inputs, right? Because it's just a read-only. And then executing it, you can see, there we go, there's our data, and it ran in 100 milliseconds. And I think the first time I ran this, it was like 5 milliseconds. So there's our data. So the Lambda function works, which need to hook it up to our school's endpoint. And we can remove the get schools endpoint that it injected for us, because we don't care about that. I think it's my brain always wanting to right-click stuff. So I don't care about this resource, so let's delete that. We're left with nice clean schools and get. And we want it to point to the Lambda function. Let's go and find our Lambda function under US West. It's called get schools. You'd like to give API permission? Yes, please. So I'm just rereading the syntax for this ARN syntax. There's our Oregon, our connection, or a unique ID, I mean. And there we go, we've got some swanky looking interface now. So you can see that the beacons are really eager to show us this new stuff, such as this test. And we can follow this flow of information from in this direction of the arrows. So you start at this test, and move right and then down and left. So method is the inbound request. Integration is what we want to do on the request. This thing on the right is just nothing, I think. Then there's what we want to do with the response. Nothing to configure there. And then what headers and parameters do we want to, what headers and modifications do we want to apply to the response. So in here, we can actually test our web API, calling our Lambda function. Let's see if we get our results, and we do. 50 milliseconds, so even quicker. We can see our first and second school. Great success. And looking in here, we can see we're not doing authorization. We've got no keys. We don't care about query strings and headers. We're just doing something very simple. We're not using IAM role security. On the inbound mapping, we're saying, we remember this from before, we're saying use the Lambda. And nothing down here. Integration response, we're saying give it 200 OK for this guy. And then opening up, we can see we've got application JSON content type. And still there, we've still got the no authorization. Cool, so there's our get method for schools. We need to deploy it. So if we deploy, it's going to say, yeah, it's going to let us create a new stage, which we'll call test. And you can see there's test to model our test environment. And within here, we get a bunch more options. So the most obvious one at the top is the URI to hit test. And then down here, we've got turn on cache. That's awesome. Let's have a bit of cache. Because this is very read-only. Give it very small stuff. I think 3600 is the max. Let's just change it quick just to see if it is. And it is. Require authorization? I don't think so. And there's your throttling down there as well, which allows you to put limits on how many times an endpoint can be called in a period of time. So let's save that. Let's hit our URI, or URL, whatever you prefer to call it. So there we go, we can see schools, we can see name first, name second. And you can see that we've got the application JSON set in our response. So that's working. So models is helpful because models, it really is an area for allowing you to specify JSON schema for validating your inbound JSON requests. So you can use it for if someone sends you some information, you can check that it conforms to what you expect before you even process it. So you could define a model schema in this area. So yeah, we've created our Lambda function, we've created our API Gateway function, we've hooked them up, it's yielding data, and everything's looking good. It was a very simple example, but it gives you a start. The only concern is actually writing lots of code within an inline editor, right? Like it's mitigating the or trying to find a way to make that simple and straightforward. I googled it and it seemed like there was a few projects out there on GitHub that had environments that you could run locally that simulated the Lambda environment. So you could in theory build on your local machine and then copy and paste up or put your zipped content up onto the server once it was complete. Because otherwise it's going to be nightmarish when when you're importing third-party modules and libraries and trying to build production-worthy code by copying and pasting into a text editor on a remote server. It's going to be a painful experience, I think. So, I mean, from a sanity check point of view or a sane point of view, I think starting off with keeping your Lambda functions simple and straightforward. Perhaps just doing maps or reduces, modifying input content. But yeah, please like if you like the video. I hope that was helpful, and leave any questions in the comments below.